Look at this, the rise of tunnels. Ooh, this is interesting. Gaza's tunnels, formalizing the informal economy. A critical economic development in the Strip, not the Vegas Strip, the Gaza Strip. Tunnels burrowing under the Gaza-Egypt border have existed since the 1980s, but in the space of a few years, they mushroomed from a few dozen to about 500 by the eve of OCL. By 2012, estimates reached as high as 1,100 to 1,200 tunnels, of which anywhere from 200 to 600 were believed operational. Such growth is a direct consequence of the blockade and has taken place largely at the expense of the formal private sector discussed above. So why are these Zios trying to clutch their pearls at the presence of tunnels into the Gaza Strip? Literally, they had to be reduced to burrowing underground, to smuggling things that they need for their survival and their right to self-determine, because Israel has imposed a literal siege on this strip of land. How do people in their right mind defend Israel still and accuse Hamas of smuggling, accuse the Palestinians of smuggling, when they are literally denied having an economy? They're denied. Do we have a Zio in here? Why can't they just get sane Israeli commentators who can talk about the war properly? Yeah, we know that Zionism is a Christian movement. It's an anti-Semitic movement. Now, the tunnels didn't appear until the 1980s. We just learned that. Okay, that's 2 decades worth of an illegal occupation that was condemned by international law. So imagine that. So such growth is a direct consequence of the blockade and has taken place largely at the expense of the formal private sector discussed above. Already by 2008, the World Bank was reporting a redistribution of wealth from the formal private sector toward informal black market operators. Yeah, you think these guys want to live in hiding? They just choose to be this way. It's so silly. By the end of that year, the massive destruction wrought by Israel's OCL. What is OCL? Does anybody know what that stands for? Oh, Operation Cast Lead. Oopsies. Israel's Operation Cast Lead provided a further push to the tunnel economy, as the massive reconstruction required materials barred entry by the blockade. So this is another, Cast Lead was at the end of 08 into 09. Remember, it's just important to remember that Cast Lead only stopped after 22 days because President Obama made a phone call to the Israeli Prime Minister saying, look, I'm about to get inaugurated. I can't have this bad press, okay? He was going to get inaugurated on January 20th of 2009, as every president does on January 20th when it's election year. And that's the reason that the Israeli operation stopped. Up until that point, if we need to go over this for those of you that are new in the class, Operation Cast Lead was the worst operation to happen up until that point in the Gaza Strip committed by Israel. The death toll was something on the order of 1,400 people. I mean, it's disputed, but they say that it's, oddly enough, it's like something around the order of 1,200 civilians and maybe 200 Hamas fighters or something like that. But it was overwhelmingly civilians. So, yeah, where's the retribution for Operation Cast Lead? They killed, literally, you could say, like, what about the 1,200 Israeli civilians October 7th? Okay, well, what about the 1,200 civilians, Palestinian civilians in January of 2009? Okay? If you're a Zionist, Zionists are inherently violent. That is the core feature of Zionism, is racial violence. Keep coping, bozo. So what my point was about Operation Cast Lead, about Operation Protective Edge, is that famously, and this is decried in hundreds of human rights reports written on this matter, that after these illegal, murderous, high-tech bombing campaigns and raids into the Gaza Strip, where they decimate civilian infrastructure, just like they said they were going to do, just like they outlined strategically, formally in their Dahaya Doctrine, just as they cleverly refer to as mowing the lawn. After these crazy, insane war crimes, you have the imposition of a blockade. So after all of that destruction, what Amnesty International called 22 days of death and destruction, after thousands upon thousands and tens of thousands of buildings were demolished, the Israeli government, impose a blockade. They restrict, just like they're restricting now, humanitarian aid and rebuilding materials. They don't allow trucks in. They don't allow anything in. Leading one human rights report to acknowledge, after Operation Protective Edge, which was then the most violent and most destructive operation in 2014, which superseded, the destruction and death caused by Operation Cast Lead in 2009. Human rights advocates included take 147 years to rebuild Gaza back to the state that it was in 2014, a decade ago, because of the blockade, because of the amount of trucks that were allowed in on a daily basis into the Gaza Strip. It's simple math. They could not feasibly rebuild. And that was by design, okay? And that is a war crime. That itself is a war crime, okay? Under international law, okay? We can go into that too if you'd like. I've got the receipts for that, what documents we can look at. Just ask me, okay? Very important that we see all of this to understand the phenomena, as Sarah Roy puts it, in the rise of the tunnel network. The rise of the tunnels. The tunnels were almost entirely devoted to smuggling goods in to Gaza. Exports were limited and included horses, scrap, metal, excess aggregate, ammunition, and certain Israeli re-exports, shoes, mobile phones, and hair gel, for which there was Egyptian demand. The tunnels allowed Gaza to circumvent the blockade and, to a larger degree than expected, reduce dependence on Israel. By mid-2010, the tunnel trade supplied 90% of all construction materials, fuel, and appliances. This is really important here, because what they say is that the tunnels were used to smuggle weapons. Well, overwhelmingly, it was rebuilding materials. It was 90% construction materials, fuel, and appliances. 70% of all the clothing in Gaza came from tunnels. 60% of all the food, okay? 20% of all tunnel goods arrived spoiled. So even if it was smuggled through the tunnel, the food might very well be spoiled by the time it got to where it needed to be. According to Nicholas Pelham, who has written extensively on the tunnel economy in the late 90s, quote, all but 1% of Gaza's total imports came from or via Israel. By the eve of Operation Cast Lead in December 2008, the ratio had nearly reversed. So in the late 90s, think about this, in the late 1990s, 99% of all of Gaza's total imports came from Israel in some fashion. By 2008, so the late 2000s, a decade later, that ratio had reversed. So now it's 99% of the total Gazan imports are now coming from a tunnel network, okay? And 1% of their needs is coming from Israel, which is imposing, and that you can see by the numbers, the material effect of imposing a harsh blockade. Now, detractors, Zios, baby brains will say, well, that's because they elected a terror group. Okay, well, first of all, under international law, just because you say it's a terror group and just because they elected a government that you don't like, it still doesn't give you a right to bomb that country or to bomb that territory. It doesn't give you the right to commit war crimes because you don't like who they elected. That's the first point. And the second point is that it's simply not true. By all accounts, and I just went over this with
Nixon ordered Cambodian genocide. Clinton sent cruise missiles to Sudan, people died. Obama gave the orders to do drone strikes.